Hi, everyone. Welcome to Natural Languages and welcome to a new episode of the Language Input Podcast. And in today's interview, I'm going to have Jeff McQuillan on the show. And, he got to work with Stephen Krashen himself at the University of Southern California. He's really an expert when it comes to language acquisition and comprehensible input. And he's going to tell us about his experience both as a teacher and a language student himself, his experience as a content creator for language learners, and much more. So hope you enjoy it, and let's get right into it. Let's go. All right. Hi, Jeff.
Good morning, Alvaro. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and welcome to the podcast. First of all, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
And well, first of all, as usual, just tell us a little bit about yourself, especially when it comes to your experience with languages as a student yourself, a language teacher, anything that comes to your mind.
Okay, well, my background, I got into language learning and language teaching almost at the same time. Okay. I moved to, I lived in Mexico. I was studying Spanish in Mexico back in 1987 after I had finished my undergraduate degree. And I ended up really loving the place where I was staying, the city I was staying at, called Cuernavaca, which is south of Mexico City. Mm-hmm. And I was there for about 4 or 5 weeks. And because I decided I wanted to stay a longer time, I realized that it would be easy for me to get a job as an English teacher. Right. So almost immediately upon starting my language learning, I also started teaching. It was my first teaching position. I turned out I just really fell in love with the teaching. Mm. And now I should say that I'd studied Spanish, as a lot of people do in high school and again in college. I never got beyond the first couple of semesters, but I didn't come in as a true beginner. So when I went to Mexico, I was what we would call a false beginner, right? I had some experience, even though I was starting from the beginning of their course. I really wasn't a true beginner, but my Spanish was very, very limited. And so it turns out that I ended up staying in Mexico for about 3 or 4 months. Okay. Much longer than I anticipated. My initial plan was to study in Mexico and then travel in Spain, actually. I wanted to go to Spain, which that didn't happen for another 20 years. But anyway, I ended up really loving Spanish. And so I came back to, I was living in Minnesota, where I was born and raised. I had studied at the University of Minnesota and decided that I would go back and get an undergraduate degree in Spanish and eventually get some sort of, well, I didn't really know, but probably a teaching certificate, which is what I ended up doing. Mm-hmm. So I returned, got a degree in Spanish, went back to Mexico a couple of times, actually during that period. I have the wrong glasses on. From when you get old, you have more glasses than you then you can remember which to wear. So it turns out that I really enjoyed teaching, and I ended up getting a master's degree in teacher education, also in Minnesota. And my first job, paid job after my English teaching positions in Mexico, was a high school teacher. So I was a high school Spanish teacher at a large suburban school district outside of Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And I did that for a year, but I decided that I didn't love teaching at that level. Right. And I had the opportunity to come to Los Angeles. So this is 1991. I moved to Los Angeles and actually started briefly a Spanish school, a private Spanish school for adults here in LA. And that didn't go so well. It was a difficult time economically, and I honestly didn't know what I was doing in terms of the business. But one thing it did do is continue to give me opportunities in terms of my teaching. So I ended up getting a position teaching Spanish at one of the local public universities, and I taught Spanish. Now, go back a little. One of the most important things that happened to me in Mexico, after I went back to the University of Minnesota and I decided to get a degree in Spanish, one of my instructors there, a woman by the name of Carol Klee, who was a professor of Spanish. She might still be a professor of Spanish there. And her interest was applied linguistics. And so I had to take an applied linguistics class as part of my preparation. And she said, if you're interested in language acquisition, you really need to read this guy called Krashen, Steve Krashen. You should really read his. Now, this is 1988, when I was first introduced to Steve's work. And as soon as I read it, I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is like a revelation about comprehensible input. And so one of the advantages I had, I think, in Mexico was that I started to really understand what language acquisition was about. So I wouldn't waste my time doing things that weren't going to help me, which meant I spent a lot of time reading. I read a lot in Mexico, even though I was obviously there and speaking and listening and watching TV. I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of newspaper reading because I love keeping up with the news. And so I would read the Mexican newspapers and the magazines, got interested sort of in Mexican politics. I mean, you get interested in the politics of the country you're living in often. And so I did a lot of reading. So that experience really opened up my eyes to what language acquisition was all about. Now, by pure coincidence, absolutely, one of these things that just happens by luck. One of Steve's relatives had studied at the Spanish school that I studied at and was working with in Mexico. And Steve decided to come down and give a 2-week conference to teachers in Mexico about language acquisition and take Spanish classes himself because he wasn't a Spanish speaker at the time. And so I got to meet Steve and spent sort of 2 weeks with him. So when I moved to Los Angeles, now Steve at the time was a professor of linguistics at the University of Southern California. We went out for lunch and blah, blah, blah. So one thing leads to another. And by 1993, I decided that I wanted to go back and get my PhD in language acquisition. And of course, Steve was already a friend and a colleague. And he said, well, why don't you come and study at USC? So I did. And I ended up getting a degree in language education at USC, studied under Steve. Steve was my advisor. We were writing papers together from our graduate student days, along with, of course, other students of his. And we had a nice little group of people who were interested in language acquisition. Steve really opened up my eyes again in terms of not only the theory of language acquisition and the practice of language acquisition, but how language acquisition theory was tied not just to second language learning, which was what I was mostly interested in when I started my program, but also things like first language acquisition, reading acquisition, all of these fields, bilingual acquisition, all of these fields are connected. And the same basic language acquisition theory that we acquire languages by getting comprehensible input, by understanding the messages that are communicated to us, and that everything that you need for language acquisition comes from that comprehensible input. Once I understood that principle, I started to see those connections in things like reading acquisition. So my PhD thesis actually has nothing to do with foreign language learning at all, in a direct sense. I did my work on reading. In fact, I published my first book was called The Literacy Crisis. It was all about reading acquisition. But once you understand the theory, you see how ideas of other scholars like Frank Smith and Ken Goodman, their work is complementary to what Steve was doing. So Steve not only opened up my eyes in terms of what language acquisition could be like, what it consisted of. He also got me thinking about how other types of language acquisition works, whether it be first language acquisition, second language acquisition, bilingual, and so forth. I taught English during my time at USC to graduate students, international students, and then got a position teaching teachers how to teach. So I actually was preparing secondary, what we call in the United States, secondary teachers. So that would be grades 7 through 12 or junior and senior high school. I was preparing those teachers who were going to go out and teach ESL or teach students whose first language is not English, which of course here in Los Angeles, that's a huge population. A huge percentage of our student population come from homes where English is not their native language. So I was preparing teachers, and I did that for several years. I worked at a university here in Southern California, and I worked in Arizona. I came back and worked here. And then my path sort of changed, and I ended up doing a lot of consulting work with school districts. So I would go out and I would give presentations about language acquisition. And at that time, I was no longer teaching languages. I was teaching teachers how to teach languages. But I really loved teaching languages, and I kind of missed that. And so about 2005, I had discovered this new, read an article in the newspaper about this new technology called podcasting, which no one had, I mean, it had just been invented six months earlier. And so along with my colleague, Lucy Say, Dr. Lucy Say, and I, we together formed this, started this podcast called English as a Second Language Podcast, or ESLPOD.com. And I started recording English lessons, and I loved teaching English. And so it was great to get on the microphone and record lessons in English. And at the time, we were one of the very first podcasts in iTunes at all, and for many countries, we were the #1 podcast in that country for several years when podcasting first began in 2005, up to maybe 2010, 2015, when podcasting started to become more popular. Right. We were probably the second language podcast ever on the internet, and that was exciting, and it gave us a chance to take Steve's ideas, to take comprehensible input and really, do something that was purely that. And so we started creating lessons based on dialogues and based on cultural information that was basically a kind of, concentrated form, if you will, of 15-20 minutes of comprehensible input. And we created these episodes. We eventually created a business out of it. But for us, the exciting thing was to be able to get back to teaching, but not have to worry about schools or textbooks or anything. Kind of get directly to the person that you want to teach,
and that's have more freedom to do whatever you want to do and the way you want to do it. Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly right. So, and that's really what we've been doing. I've been doing for the last 17, 18, I don't know how many years that is. And it's been great. We've really loved doing it.
Cool. And so are they like cultural episodes in which you just talk about cultural things for 15-20 minutes?
Exactly. Yes. We started, I'll tell you, well, almost all the material was written by my colleague, Dr. Say, who's the creative genius behind the whole episode, the whole enterprise. But I'm just the person who records the episodes. But yes, we were able to do, we recorded, I think maybe 600 or so lessons, around 30 minutes each, about all sorts of cultural topics: history, politics, movies, books, just anything that someone might be interested in. And of course, the whole idea was to create something that was not just comprehensible, but what Steve and Benico Mason, who I think would call compelling input, something that would be so interesting that you would really want to listen to it. And we got really great feedback from people who would download the podcast and listen to it. Now, we were interested in sort of intermediate and above. We didn't really address the beginning language teaching. And I think there's a lot of really exciting things going on right now in beginning language teaching, storytelling, things like that. And there's some really great people like yourself who are taking some of these ideas and bringing them to other languages like Spanish and Portuguese and Alice Ayel doing French. Yeah. She's just doing some great stuff, and Benico's been doing some great stuff. And so to me, that's been the most interesting, development in the last 5 years or so in terms of what's going on in comprehensible input style language teaching.
Yeah, and there are more and more projects by the minute and different languages, which is amazing. Yeah. And back to your point, I was going to ask you about the level in your podcast, because when it comes to Spanish or any other language for that matter, when you're dealing with beginners, visual help is really important.
Absolutely.
The great thing about podcasts is you can listen to them while you're doing other things, right? You can, you're just cleaning the house or things like that, or running outside, or
that's harder to do, and that's one of the challenges. And we were so lucky in doing English because there's a much larger group of people who are intermediate or lower advanced, right? And so and from a business perspective, that's important too, because we don't have to put our website in 17 languages. Our website is in English, which means the only people who are actually going to be interested in buying our memberships are people who can already navigate an English website, right? Whereas if you're doing a beginning, and this is one reason, by the way, that we've never even tried to do beginning English. Well, there are two reasons. One, most people already come in with beginning English isn't the big problem.
Right.
Even though beginning English is taught poorly in most countries, it is taught. And so there's lots of people who already have that experience, that have that level of acquisition. And secondly, it's if you're going to do a beginning class, you've got to have your website in all of the languages of the people who are going to buy your materials. So for people like yourself and doing say Spanish or Portuguese, or I'm not sure what other languages you do, you've got to be able to sell to your customer, and that probably means putting your website in English or maybe a few other languages. Makes it more difficult. And as you're absolutely right though, that for beginning language teaching, the visual is so important. In fact, I wrote a white paper, a document for Apple back in 2008. And I talked about precisely that the future in terms of podcasting, audio podcasting isn't going to work very well for absolute beginners because there's nothing to make the input comprehensible. You've got to have the visuals, like TPR storytelling or TPR or storytelling like Benico does. That is really important. And so for someone who's going to do the beginning, and that's more difficult to do, right? But there are people out there doing it, and like Alice Ayel, her French, I've watched some of those, and they're great. And it's just a board, and she draws on the board, and you understand exactly what she's saying. So really powerful stuff.
I mean, if you're creating podcasts for beginners, you can play around with sounds a little bit, but still not going to be the same. Like, there's a storm here and you hear the storm. So you can you can think about several things, but
you're right.
Nothing beats that visual help. But
I think that's one of the problems actually in beginning language teaching is that we're not quite yet at the point where you can easily produce that in a form that is going to be appealing to people. Like I say, I think Ayel's work has and Benico's work is really interesting, but it's harder to, you've got to get people to understand why you're doing that, because otherwise they think, one of the biggest problems I think with all those of us who are interested in comprehensible input is that most people see language learning as something different. They see it as studying rules and memorizing vocabulary and doing exercises. So, they go on to these commercial websites like Duolingo and so on, and it's all quizzes and quizzes. Now, those websites can give you comprehensible input, right? But they also give you a lot of other things that aren't necessarily useful. And because that's the mindset that people have, this is what language learning should look like. And so they come to, a site like ours or a site like yours or else, and they go, well, what is this? Where's the grammar? Where's the vocabulary memorization? And so one of the things that we have to do is get people to understand what language acquisition is about. I think that's important. There's a limit to how much people are really interested. I think if you can show them that they can understand things, especially initially, and that they're able to make progress just understanding, I think that's really what gets people. And so that's where storytelling, for example, comes in. I don't know, have you done some of that in terms of beginning language teaching, the storytelling?
Yes, because the good thing about Spanish, which is the language I personally teach, is most people that are interested in Spanish are either native English speakers or third country, from another country who already speak English. So with writing down the story, I can get away with a lot of things that I wouldn't with a completely different language, right? So just by writing things down, just like within the flow of the story, not talking about grammar, of course not. But yeah, that's something that I keep thinking about, like different ideas to help even beginners, right? And back to your point, that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast, to talk with other teachers and people who have read Stephen Krashen's books and understand why comprehensible input is important and so on, because to sort of educate listeners on how the process actually works. But I actually remember, because you said that when you're starting from scratch, or when you're a beginner in a language, and you see that you can understand a story and that you're having fun, I think that's where the moment in which you start to realize that this is actually my work. Like, because I remember back in 2016, I went to a workshop in France for TPRS teachers, and then I met Stephen Krashen then as well. And I remember in the afternoon we had like little demos in which teachers got to practice their teaching skills with languages so we, the other teachers, were the students. And I remember being a student in a Hungarian class, in an Indonesian class. And it's those languages that I had no idea about. Like, I didn't know even one word, nothing. Just with the story, you start to realize, I actually understand what he or she is saying, right? Because back to your point with English, because most people studied it at some point in their lives, most people have little background in the language and they can understand a little bit. So as I like to put it, people are confused as to what's actually helping them, because they had that experience before. They don't give comprehensible input the credit that they should, because they had some experience. But when you're starting from scratch with a language like the ones I just mentioned, you realize that, wait a minute, they actually works, and you're actually having fun because you're creating stories together. And
I think for me, this is a really exciting time for language teachers and people like us who are interested in pursuing comprehensible input solutions, if you will, to language to language teaching. I think there are a lot of, I think we need to experiment. And one of the great things about the work of people like Beniko and her colleagues is that they're really willing to experiment with different approaches and not be satisfied. The total physical response, James Asher's total physical response was a brilliant idea, and it was a brilliant approach that was years ahead of came before Krashen in terms of the actual techniques. He didn't quite catch the theory, but he had some an approach and method that really was effective. But we don't want to stop with that. We want to, storytelling is great, but maybe there's something even more. So I'm really excited. I think there's a couple of things that, if someone were interested in this, that they would want to pursue. And one thing is short content. People are used to now on the internet consuming, if you will, really short pieces of content. So, if you go on and do a Duolingo lesson, you can be done if you move quickly, in maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes tops. Yeah. Okay, and so and people's attention span gets shorter. So producing very short pieces of content, but lots of them, and interesting content, that's one challenge. For beginning teaching, that could be a simple story. That could be an illustrated dialogue. There could be a lot of different things you do. One of the things I tried I actually had a Spanish podcast very briefly back in 2007, 2008. It was called Spanish para Todos. And I produced a couple episodes. I ended up taking them off because it just got to be a problem. But one of the things I experimented with was doing what's called preview review. So I would start the podcast and say in English, okay, this is going to be a story about a guy who goes to the grocery store and something bad's going to happen to him. And but eventually he finds a solution to his problem, something very general like that. And then I would read the story in Spanish very slowly, very clearly, very comprehensively. And then I would go and I would explain in Spanish the story. And so this was not for zero beginners. Okay, this was more for sort of someone who had maybe 1 quarter of Spanish or 1 semester of college Spanish. So they knew a little bit, but they didn't know very much. But occasionally I would put a word of English, but not very much in the explanation here and there. And then at the end of the story, I would say, okay, so here's what we learned. And I wouldn't retell the whole story, but I would give a few key things that would, help make sense of the story. So that sort of approach, preview review, which was something that has been used in bilingual education for many years, things like that for an audio, say, only product, that might be an approach. And there's probably a half a dozen other ways of thinking about how we teach languages. And so, my hope is that, young teachers like you coming into the field are able to bring us, some new ideas and just experiment and just, maybe this will work. And the great thing about the internet is it doesn't really cost very much money for you to distribute that and get feedback from people, whether they like it or not.
Yeah. Yes, I look at content creation in 2 different ways, meaning that one in which, because I teach Spanish as well, online to adults. Yeah. So there is slight differences because on one side I have the adults that I teach, so we interact within our classes, and on the other side is the lessons, the videos that I create for YouTube or other platforms. And yeah, obviously when you're teaching live, you have your students there. The advantages like live feedback, and you get to adjust to their needs, and you can see their faces and so on. Whereas with content that you create for everybody, you can please everybody, right? But I like both ideas, because with when I'm teaching my students, of course it's easier because I see their reaction. I can write things down on the fly. We get to improvise a little bit as well, which is fun, things like that. Whereas with the content for YouTube and those platforms, I can think about different ideas and prepare them beforehand. But some, I'd call them unconventional ideas that I've been using recently. One is to play board games, for example.
Oh, really?
So I do it for both in my classes and for videos. And the way I do it is I learn the rules before. And then during my classes, for example, I explain them the rules in Spanish, so the target language, and we play in Spanish. So it's Spanish all the time. But the weird thing about board games is that you have pieces and dice and things. So you get to see the board and you can play online. There are several platforms. And, you know, I use Zoom, and because I can write down text, or I can draw arrows, things like that. So you move these pins around here because you want to produce this specific resource. So it's really visual and it's fun because you're playing, right?
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. That's fantastic, Alvaro. I mean, that is really interesting. Really interesting. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That sort of innovation, that sort of new ideas, and taking, you know, I mean, I'm old school. I don't do video games, you know, and I haven't played a board game in years. But that's really an exciting idea. I'd love to see an example of that. You need to email me a link to that.
Sure.
Yeah. I'd love to do that.
Just an example, but you know, like at the end of the day, it's about you know, thinking about activities or resources that resemble real life. But your job, or our job, I mean, is just to make them comprehensible, right? Yeah,
absolutely. That's it. That's it exactly. I've got to run in a couple of minutes. Is there anything final you wanted to ask me?
No. I mean, that was awesome, actually. Like, it was really great to get your ideas and your knowledge about this field.
Well, if somebody's interested, I actually have a website in addition to our website where we teach English, ESLPOD. I have a website for teachers. I don't put much on it, a lot, but occasionally I will. And some of those articles are related to language teaching. It's called backseatlinguist.com. So that's backseat, BACKSEAT, and then linguist, LINGUIST.com. And if any of the teachers out there are interested in finding out more about my work in terms of teaching and, you know, professional development, they can go to that website and perhaps find some interesting stuff. And I look forward to hearing more about your work, Alvaro, and watching these videos. This is a great project, and thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you for, you know, it was a pleasure to have you. And I forgot, just I'll link all the links that you mentioned. I'll just link them in the description. So
okay, excellent.
You spell them, but that's fine.
Okay, very good. Excellent. All right. Thank you, Alvaro. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.